the events of the last 48 hours here in Brazil are some of the most alarming and shocking I've ever seen. And I'm not using hyperbole for that. I'm going to show you why. So, as we've been telling you for a while now, there is a law that is being proposed in Brazil that will become one of the most repressive laws in the democratic world that controls the content that can be published and expressed on social media. It empowers the state, the government, with extreme, virtually unlimited power to ban and punish any speech that in their sole and unilateral discretion they declare to be either hate speech or disinformation. We've talked many times about how this disinformation industry, this term, is the Rosetta Stone for how Western governments and democratic governments are attempting to destroy a free internet because they realize that they can no longer maintain their repressive rule and allow a free internet. These two things are not compatible. That was the realization of the Democratic Party in the United States government when things got too free and it led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which was never supposed to happen. And when the United Kingdom ignored their elites and adopted Brexit, and when Brazilians voted for Jair Bolsonaro, things started getting too unstable for the neoliberal order, and they decided that they could no longer tolerate a free internet, and the primary justification for censorship laws they're now trying to impose is that there's too much disinformation online, it's too destructive and harmful, and obviously whoever gets to determine what is and isn't disinformation wields enormous power, given that, like most things, it's in the eye of the beholder. And what the Brazil law would do is it does not say you get to go to courts and ask courts to decide whether or not something is disinformation or fake or hate speech and then have them order it removed. It says that the social media companies are responsible to remove it the minute it appears, and if they don't, they can be held both civilly and criminally liable for whatever results are of those postings. And again, it's completely in the discretion of the government and whoever the officials or bodies are that are determining disinformation and hate speech to make those assessments. And it's completely open-ended. There's no concrete definition of it. These are all subjective terms, and obviously the point of it is to ensure that there's no more dissent on the internet. And in Brazil, the leading institutions in support of the censorship law, just like in the United States, are the most powerful media corporations because they know the internet is what has caused them to lose control over their ability to dictate the flow of information, and the only way to get that back is to take away freedom of the internet. There's also financial motives there. There's part of this law determines a better distribution of profits to media outlets instead of Google and Facebook, but it also empowers the state to censor the internet in the name of disinformation and free speech. And although it's Lula's government who's, if it passes, will end up implementing it, it's the media outlets in Brazil that have led the way in agitating for these laws, and the Brazilian left, not entirely, but largely, is marching behind these media corporations, just like they do in the United States, thinking somehow that they're going to be immune from application of these censorship laws. So here is the article we published back in February on our Locals platform, describing what the law is. There you see the headline, "New law sought by Brazil's Lula to ban and punish, quote, fake news and disinformation threatens the free internet everywhere." And then the headline, the subheadline was, "Many nations seem poised to abandon the core lesson of the Enlightenment. No human institution can or should be trusted to decree absolute truth and punish dissent from it." And that ultimately is the point. That was the lesson of the Enlightenment. Prior to the Enlightenment, we did have institutions, monarchs, churches, emperors, who dictated truth. And nobody was permitted to dissent or deviate from those decrees. You were punished, you were killed, you were imprisoned, you were exiled. And the point of the Enlightenment of Voltaire and John Locke and the philosophers from France and Britain and the rest of Europe that ended up being the foundation for the American founding and modern day liberties throughout the democratic world is that what should dictate truth is human reason and a free debate, not centralized control. We're reverting back to the pre-Enlightenment era where institutions of authority dictate to us what truth is. That's what this law is for. Now, I describe what the law is. I'm going to skip that for the moment. I basically have described what it is, and those of you can go and read it. It's available to everybody on the Locals platform. But what happened over the last week is really amazing. So we are headed in Brazil, the Congress is, to a vote. It was supposed to be scheduled for today. It may still happen tonight. They're only going to hold the vote if it passes. They're struggling to get a majority in Congress for it. I believe it might have already been delayed. It's a little unclear, the news reports right before we went on air. But they're working very hard to kind of barter and trade to get a majority for this bill to ensure that it passes. And as I said, the leading advocates of this law are media outlets in Brazil, giant media corporations like the Globo Corporation that has ruled Brazil forever, as well as centrist and left-wing political factions that believe, probably rightly, that at least in the short term it will largely be used against the Bolsonaro movement, as censorship powers in Brazil have been used to silence Bolsonaro supporters for the last 4 or 5 years, something we've also covered on this show. Obviously, in the future, if someone else gets hold of the mechanisms of the censorship machine, it will be turned on whomever they view as a dissident. People don't care about the midterm or long term. They just want short-term power and the ability to silence their adversaries. But what has happened is the opponents, the most vocal opponents of this bill, aside from conservatives in Brazil and some free speech advocates on the left, are the tech platforms, are social media companies like Google and Facebook and Spotify and Twitter. And they have begun a public campaign to convince people that the government is spreading disinformation about this law, trying to convince people that if this law is passed, it'll not only destroy internet freedom, but actually make it more difficult to rid the internet of disinformation. Because what is and is not disinformation will no longer have some sort of outside arbiter, but instead will be determined by the state. And what will likely happen if you're a social media company operating in a country where the government has said that you will be held civilly or criminally liable if you allow disinformation or hate speech to appear is you'll just censor everything other than I love Lula or the most tepid kind of comments. You'll just preemptively ban everything out of fear that you'll be held liable. And these companies are also concerned that they're being forced into servitude to government propaganda. And so Google and Facebook in particular have been advocating publicly against the law, trying to use their platforms the way Brazilian media outlets have been using theirs in favor of the law to explain to people why it's not in their interest for this law to pass. And the fact that Google and Facebook and Spotify and other tech companies that operate in Brazil have been advocating against this law has infuriated the government so much that they are now prohibiting these companies from criticizing this law any longer. And not only have they done that, but they have also ordered the presidents of those three companies, Google, Facebook, and Spotify in Brazil, to appear before the Brazilian FBI equivalent called the Federal Police to be interrogated about their campaigns against this bill. So here from today in O Globo, which is the newspaper of the media outlet that is most aggressively advocating for this law, here you see the headline that we've translated for you. It's about a Supreme Court judge who we've covered on this show before. His name is Alexander de Moraes, and I just need to go back and show you who he is. He has become, here's an AP article on him, notorious in the West because he simply rules Brazil with censorship orders. Here you see the AP article from January 2023, Crusading Judge Tests Boundaries of Free Speech in Brazil. I did a show where I reported on a secret order of his, where he ordered multiple platforms, including Rumble, Facebook, Google, to ban the accounts of elected officials, of podcasters, of journalists, with no explanation, secret orders, no due process, and gave them 2 hours to comply under threat of heavy fines, daily fines, if they failed to comply. And this has been the judge that the left used to regard as fascist and authoritarian. He was actually long on the right. And now they regard him as a hero because he has taken on the role of censoring speech in Brazil. His primary targets were supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro, whom he's ordered imprisoned without trial, whose houses he's ordered searches and siege, whose journalists he's forced into exile, and who has undertaken the unilateral power to censor the internet and ban people from it with no trial of any kind. So it's this judge that is so authoritarian that even Western media outlets have begun to object. The New York Times has at least twice run articles on him, who today issued an order on his own barring Google and Facebook and Spotify from criticizing this proposed law any longer, even though this law will have a gigantic impact on how Facebook, Google, Spotify, and other companies operate. Media outlets in Brazil that are aligned with the government's agenda, that support this law, are completely free to do what they've been doing, which is drowning everybody in propaganda about the necessity of this law. But the most influential critics of this law, the tech companies, are now banned by law from arguing against this law. And not only are they banned by law, but they are now being forced to appear at the federal police for interrogation. One of the things Google did, here you see, if you go to the Google front page in Brazil, yesterday, they had a headline that appears right on the front page of Google with a link that essentially, that in Portuguese, the English translation is, the fake news law proposed could make your internet worse. And you click on that link and it brings you to a blog from Google that explains their arguments about why this law is bad. This is no longer allowed. They were ordered today to remove this blog, to remove this link, and the head of Google in Brazil is now forced to appear before the federal police because the Justice Minister of Lula da Silva has opened a criminal investigation into whether or not these companies have committed crimes somehow by arguing against this law. Here, yesterday, something truly bizarre happened, which is a journalist from CNN Brazil, which is every bit as bad as CNN in the United States. She went on air live on CNN, and she tried to post a tweet advocating for this law. These journalists are not pretending to be objective. CNN, Global, and Brazil are the leading agitators for the censorship law, just like journalists in the United States are the leading censorship advocates here. She tried to post a tweet defending the censorship law, but when she tried to post the tweet, she got an error message from Twitter. Now, anybody who has ever used Twitter over the past several years, but especially in the last several months since Elon Musk fired 80% of the workforce or so, understands that Twitter often has technical difficulties. But instead of concluding that that might be why she was unable to post her very important tweet in favor of this law, she instead immediately concluded that she was so important that Twitter was censoring her. And she went on the air and she held up her laptop and she showed how she was unable. She kept pressing the button, post, post, post. And she got this error saying, I can't post. And then the proof that she thought that she was being censored was she went to her phone and she was able to post an image on her phone on Twitter, and that proved that Twitter was analyzing the content of her advocacy, and Elon Musk and others at Twitter were so incredibly obsessed with what this TV host on CNN Brazil was saying about a law that Elon Musk didn't even know existed until I talked to him about it today, and censored her. The pro-censorship activist group Sleeping Giants, that here in the United States tries to get Fox News' advertisers canceled, also exists in Brazil where they do the same thing. They claim to be very against disinformation. They try and get everybody censored and their advertisers lost, whoever is on the right. They too claimed they were being censored by both Google and Twitter for the same reason. Here you see urgent, desperation hit. Google is using its own platform to attack the law, and Twitter is logging out of people's accounts to get in the way. The big tech companies are afraid of losing their fortunes gained over the devastated lives of our children and are using everything to try to stop the law. So they also claim Twitter was censoring them because they got logged out of their account several times yesterday. Now, as soon as I saw all of this, I knew that the whole thing was a hoax, a fraud, because I had exactly the same problems on Twitter yesterday, even though I only spoke once about this law and I spoke against it. I was signed out of Twitter involuntarily at least 6 or 7 times. I kept trying to post tweets and was getting the same error message that she was getting. But I assumed not that there was some conspiracy to silence me on the part of Twitter, but that Twitter was just having technical difficulties. And yet, the Justice Minister in Brazil, Flavio Dino, who is probably the leading advocate of this censorship law, he's the one who wants to control the internet. He's the one who also ordered Google and Facebook and Spotify to cease engaging in advocacy against the law that he wants upon some huge penalty that Congress hasn't approved and that the courts haven't approved either. Went onto Twitter, he retweeted both the crazy, deranged CNN host claiming Elon Musk had censored her and Sleeping Giants claiming the same thing. And he retweeted both of those tweets, and he said, I am forwarding the matter to the analysis of the National Consumer Secretariat, an agency of the Ministry of Justice, in view of the possibility of configuration of abusive practices by companies. Now, almost immediately when these tweets went up, the community notes function of Twitter, which is one of the best innovations Elon Musk has brought, it's an ability of a community of people in Twitter to fact check journalists and others, politicians, when they lie, immediately noted that Reuters had a report that everyone could go and read online about the global technical problems and instability Twitter was experiencing yesterday. And that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of Twitter users were experiencing exactly the same problems as Sleeping Giants and the CNN host, only they all understood that it was because of tech problems that Twitter faced, and not because they were being targeted as some free speech martyrs. But this justice minister took that and threatened Twitter with criminal prosecution and is also threatening these other companies from opposing this law. Now, as I said, I spoke to Elon Musk about this today to try and get Twitter's response. He then went online and mocked the CNN host and said Twitter had global problems all day yesterday because so many people were logging on that the bandwidth needed to be expanded, and when they expanded it, the problems were solved, which is exactly what Reuters said, and thousands of other people in Brazil said that they were experiencing, including ones who never even mentioned this law, let alone supported it. And yet, they refused to, the CNN host, these other journalists who spread the claim that they were being censored, refused to retract it, just like in the United States, no matter how much you disprove their lies, they stick with them. But the important thing is this. This bill is used as a model in Europe and Canada. There have been multiple conferences over the last 3 months where Brazilian journalists, Brazilian politicians, Brazilian activists are invited to Paris and Berlin and London and Toronto, and they have conferences over how to regulate the internet, and they're looking at Brazil to see how far Brazil can go and how much they can get away with, because the EU wants to copy this law, and so does Canada, and so does the United States. The United States will have a harder time because of the First Amendment, but as we've seen, the Democratic Party has made no bones about the fact that they explicitly crave greater censorship of the internet in the name of both disinformation and hate speech, and they will find a way around it. But the EU and Canada have already adopted laws like this. In Canada, there's a pretty extreme law already that Justin Trudeau succeeded in enacting, though it doesn't go as far as this Brazilian one, because this Brazilian one has almost no limits. And that's really what they want. They want the ability to proclaim anything to be disinformation. So imagine if this law had existed yesterday in Brazil, while the CNN host, in her hysteria and derangement, was hallucinating that Twitter was censoring her, and she was supported not only by other journalists, but also by the government, by the justice minister. Imagine if someone like myself or somebody else had gone on and said that's not happening. They could have proclaimed our denials to be disinformation and banished us as a result. That's the power this law gives. It prevents things from being debated. That's what they did throughout the COVID pandemic, when people who dissented from the pronouncements of the World Health Organization or Dr. Fauci were banned from the internet, even though so many of those things ended up being true. It's what dissidents to the narrative of in Ukraine are suffering constantly online. There is an absolute attempt in the West to ban dissent and they recognize that the internet, because of the empowerment it gives to individuals, the ability for us to have a show like this without needing a corporation approving of what we're saying or moderating it or paying for it, is too powerful of a weapon to allow it to be free any longer. And all of these laws, starting with the one in Brazil this week, are models that are coming to you in whichever country you are, including the United States. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.